Lakeman argues that these associations are deliberately called upon in media representations of Southern white speech, observing that in Hollywood, accents are used as, quote, coded messages letting the audience know what kind of ride they're in for, end quote. Certainly the popular television series The Dukes of Hazzard, which ran from 1979 to 1985, and until recently could be seen in reruns on the now-defunct Nashville network, includes dialect that encodes stereotypical beliefs about the South. The Dukes do get some Southern cred from narrator Waylon Jennings, but it's unfortunately mostly negated by his cringeworthy scripted comments on the action, such as, quote, the ruination had done started, end quote. In her critique of what she calls the laughable dialect representations in the films Cold Mountain and Big Fish, North Carolina columnist Maria Promaggiore argues that media performances of Southern speech are deliberately exaggerated and unrealistic because, quote, there's no payoff in linguistic accuracy, or any other kind of accuracy for that matter, when the world prefers stereotypes about the South, end quote. Another reviewer of Cold Mountain suggests that the cast should have, quote, listened to a John Edwards stump speech, end quote, to hear what North Carolina speech is supposed to sound like. Even the British newspaper The Guardian notes the, quote, political agenda sometimes at work when actors do Southern accents, end quote. The article explains for British readers that, quote, the South fulfills many of the same functions for American films that the North of England fulfills in British cinema. Southerners are frequently portrayed as unsophisticated and dim, and the accent is exaggerated for comedic effect, end quote. The golden age of rural Southern TV comedies, which peaked in the 1960s and 70s, included The Andy Griffith Show, Petticoat Junction, Green Acres, The Beverly Hillbillies, and of course that dead-on representation of all things Southern, Hee Haw. According to the Zell Miller article in the Washington Post, all these shows were popular nationwide, but especially among rural Southern viewers. I think this popularity reveals something interesting about Americans and electronic media, and it's that people want to see people like themselves on television and in films. That's probably one reason why many Black Americans watched programs such as Amos and Andy, while the NAACP successfully fought to have it removed from the airwaves. As Alvin Poussin observes, quote, Black people were hungry to see any of themselves on TV or in the movies. They were willing to watch anything that included Black characters and actors, end quote, even if the representations were stereotypical or distasteful to them. The argument I'm making here is not that all media representations of Black and white Southerners in their speech are negative. I'm suggesting that media images of Southerners and of Southern speech have an impact on how their real-life referents are perceived by those outside the South and or outside the African-American community. The evidence from the earliest literary dialect, and especially the evidence from minstrelsy, supports the claim that the fictional identities constructed for such entertainments have been and continue to be instrumental in reinforcing stereotypes about groups of people, with African Americans and Southerners of all races among the most commonly portrayed. The question of what can or should be done about these constructions and their negative impacts continues to be asked by African American advocacy groups, including the NAACP and others who monitor the representations of Blacks on television and film. And along with Zell Miller and other Southern lawmakers, the Kentucky-based Center for Rural Strategies is working on addressing media representations of rural Southerners. As language variationists, we can do our part by continuing to speak and write about linguistic stereotyping and profiling it, naming it when we see and hear it, not only in our scholarly work, but also in the popular media, including op-ed pieces and letters to the editor. And I hope you'll all agree that these are conversations that sociolinguists and variationists need to be a part of. Thanks.
I'm saying she does a great job of identifying the contradictions and how these stereotypes work and how they operate as forms of ideology. My question has to do with how do you explain the reproduction of, I mean, you address some of that in your conclusion. In terms of people not calling attention to it, or but can you offer any explanation as to, or a further explanation as to how these stereotypes or forms of ideology, misrepresentations, continue to be reproduced? We're in a new century now. You just mentioned, Spike Lee's Bamboozled. So. How do you respond to that?
If you're asking why CBS are putting profit before human decency, and CBS's argument to rebut Miller was pretty much saying, well, you haven't seen the show yet. We haven't even started shooting yet. So how can you know this is wrong? And Miller's argument was, how can it not be? You're going to go out to Appalachia and find the people who have the least amount of sophistication deliberately to put them up for the entertainment of the rest of America, supposedly. And as I said, I don't agree with Zell Miller on very much, but I think he was right about that. And actually, I think the CBS project has been canned for the time being, but I think he's right that money is promoted.
Well, I take your point. I would simply say quickly that people also decide what they're going to make money off of and what they're not going to make money off of. Blacks don't have anybody to intercede on their behalf, that kind of power. And we know that, as you just pointed out, things can sell. They can even sell human beings and make that popular. So